obviously we were talking about direct-to-consumer genome testing services such as 23andMe, Ancestry.com, Family Tree DNA, etc., etc. So, who am I? My name is Meas. I'm on Twitter. I go to the University of Illinois where I do research. Next year I will be at the University of California at Berkeley. I'm going to skip through this because I was started a bit late. So first, what we need to talk about is DNA. I know this is sort of a refresher for most of you, but just bear with me for a second. So, what is DNA anyways? So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So it's a sugar attached to a nucleic acid, and it's attached in a long chain. And this is a carrier of genetic information. So it's heritable, it's passed down, it is actually directional. So reading it forwards versus reading it backwards will give you different things. And so what is a gene then? So a gene is a unit of DNA. There are varying definitions about what a gene means. Some people think that it's just, a length of DNA regardless of what happens to the DNA. But I'm going to use the definition that has been used for a while as functional genes, which is a length of DNA that gets transcribed into a protein. So what does that even mean? So we're going to have to talk about this principle called the central dogma of biology. So DNA is sort of like the source code of your whole self. Everything that makes you you is sort of encoded in this, weird molecule. And then this gets transcribed into this thing called mRNA, which is similar to DNA, but it's not the same. It's only one-stranded, whereas DNA is double-stranded, and mRNA will sometimes cut and paste things, and it's sort of like a variation of DNA. And then this mRNA goes out and gets translated into a protein. So what are proteins? Proteins basically do all the work in your cells. They are structural, they make up your hair, your skin. They are, messengers. They sort of tell your body, different cells in your body, what's going on. And, proteins also shuttle things from one part of your body to another. So proteins are responsible for, taking the oxygen that you breathe in, bringing it to other parts of your body so you don't, suffocate and die, which is kind of nice. So in humans, what does DNA sort of mean? So DNA is passed down from generation to generation, as we know. And during this passing down, it undergoes this thing called recombination, which happens in your gametes, or your sex cells, or your eggs and your sperm, if you prefer. So what happens here is your chromosomes sort of tangle together, and then they sort of switch parts. And this is called genetic recombination. And what this means, for our purposes, is that people who are more closely related will share longer strands of DNA than people who are more distantly related. And we all sort of know what heritability means, because we've all taken, high school biology. We know Mendel and his pea plants, where some of them are purple and some of them are white. If you marry a purple and a white one, most of them turn out purple, but some of them turn out white. But either you have the purple gene or you don't. But wait, we're not pea plants, we're people. People are not pea plants. Oh God, I don't have leaves. What does this mean? So what genetics sort of means functionally for people is that it doesn't really just stop at what our genome is. It doesn't stop at the A, T, C's, and G's in our base pairs. There's an entire field called epigenetics dedicated to how protein expression and gene expression is sort of changed by things that aren't just, the A, T, C's, and G's. So this can be things like how our DNA is rolled up. Is it rolled up tightly so that mRNA can be accessed and transcribed? Is it rolled up loosely so that it can be? So what I want you to take away from this is that DNA genotyping isn't an accurate descriptor of your phenotype or your expressed sort of, your blue eyes, your black hair. Please do not think that. That's a common layperson's mistake, and it's very dangerous when it comes to the field of genetics. So, moving on. Commercial genetic testing. So, when we say commercial genetic testing, what does it mean? Did they just sequence your entire genome? Didn't it take us like 10 years or more to do that? They don't sequence your entire genome. So what happens is they look at your single nucleotide polymorphisms. So, between humans, we'll share about like 99.999% of our genome. And this is just because we're of the same species. And so we have similar genes. And that, makes sense. So, small variations is what gives us our genetic diversity. And so, a single nucleotide polymorphism, as you could probably sort of assume from its name, is when one of those base pairs is flipped. So instead of an A and a T, it's a C and a G at any given site. This happens because most of the times A's and T's pair together and C's and G's pair together. But A's and G's are called pyridines, whereas C's and T's are called pyridines. And so you pair a pyridine with a pyridine, except sometimes your replication protein, your DNA polymerase, can get that sort of wrong. So instead of an A pairing with a T, it will sometimes pair as like G with a T. And then when you have that sequence replicated, it carries on through generations. And so you can either have one or the other, an A and a T or a C and a G, because there's only two pairs. So this is how most sort of direct-to-consumer companies map genotypic differences between people. And how they do that is they will take your entire genome from like the spit or the cheek swab or whatever it is they have you send in, and they'll shear it into little bite-sized fragments. Well, I suppose like everything is a bite-sized fragment when it comes to DNA because it's small, but sort of like small fragments. And then they will take a pre-made chip from a company. These chips are sometimes, $100, sometimes less if you buy in bulk. And then they will, on this chip, are all of the different sort of SNPs. So they will have this whole thing, except right here, there's a C. And right here, there's a G. And right here, there's a T. And they will take your DNA that they extracted from your cells, from your spit or whatever, and they will they will hybridize it through here. And then they will also add a single nucleotide. And if it complements, it will sort of fluoresce in this dark red color here. If it doesn't, it will not fluoresce, so that's represented by this black. Sometimes you will have both polymorphisms in your genes because your mom had one and your dad didn't have one. So that's represented by this sort of pinkish thing right here. And then a computer reads it and then it outputs this nice little graph where it tells you which nucleotides we have and which SNPs we don't have. And this is what's called a DNA fingerprint. So they sequence like 16,000 or more of these. So they get a pretty large sample size of all of these like very specific SNPs, which we think only happen once in the entire, the entire history of the human race. And so, what do we even learn from this? It's just a bunch of colors. What does that mean? So, genetic testing sort of direct-to-consumer companies, which would have you believe that from this data, you can get a lot of information. You can understand where your ancestors have come from. Who passed your genetic code on to you. If you don't know where your parents are from, you can sort of find this out from this testing. Other companies sort of have a medical test where they tell you if you have these mutations or these SNPs that are correlated with things like cancer or with other genetic diseases. And, finally, you can find other people who are living right now and who have had this genetic testing done, who might be your distant relatives. You can get in contact with them. And most of these companies have some sort of direct messaging platform where you can contact different users who might have, similar DNA as you do. But let's sort of break this down. The problem with assuming that you can figure out your ancestry, where the progenitors of you have come from, is that we didn't have genetic testing back then. How do we know what these people had if we didn't have genetic testing? And the truth of the matter is we don't. People have been migrating over time. If you look at 200 years ago, Europe was a completely different place. There are countries that didn't exist that are there. And countries that, empires that existed sometimes got broken up. And so when we're talking about ancestry, what we're actually talking about is people who gave their genetic information to these companies already, people who are living there right now. So people in Italy are making up this sort of database of Italian, quote-unquote, DNA that they're drawing from. And then they look at your DNA and they say, oh, you have this same number of SNPs that people from Italy have. So you must be part Italian. Is that really where your ancestors are from? Because humans have been moving over time. And you don't know if those ancestors that you had actually came from that region. So that's kind of bunk, actually. You're not actually learning where your ancestors are from. One of my favorite anecdotes from geneticists about, sort of misconceptions about genetics is that we currently have this notion that 1% of the entire Asian population is directly descended from Genghis Khan. Why? Because there are some similarities in SNPs and Y chromosome fragments that 1% of people from the Asian population have. And we know that a long time ago, Genghis Khan sort of raped his way across the continent, spreading his seed far and wide to the wind like some magnificent dandelion. But we actually don't know if it's from Genghis Khan. We don't know where the tomb of Genghis Khan is. We haven't sequenced his DNA. So one of my favorite takes is that it could just be some dude who got around. And, he went down in history, and people thought he was Genghis Khan, but really he was just good. actually don't know where your ancestors are from, and saying that we can tell you where your ancestors are from is kind of reductionist and pretty, sort of, it's a lie. We don't know. So what about cancer? What about like genetic predispositions to disease? While there are some SNPs, some genes, some alleles of certain genes that will make you more susceptible to cancer. For example, the BRCA1 gene. Certain mutations in that gene will make you more susceptible to breast cancer. This isn't the full story. And you can see this because, biology is super complex and also pretty dumb. It doesn't work the way that we think it's going to work all the time. It's only half of the answer to look at the actual genomic data from DNA. Actually, the actual phenotype that you express, whether you have or don't have cancer, is kind of dependent on other things that we don't fully understand. And furthermore, some of the genetic testing doesn't test for all genes that could potentially make you have cancer. So say you have genes 1, 2, and 3. If you have certain mutations in genes 1, 2, and 3, you might get cancer. And this test only tests for gene 1 and 2. And it tells you, it's fine. You don't have the genes that will make you have cancer. Go on with your life. But what about if you have the mutation in gene 3? It's sort of a false hope, isn't it? And that's sort of the case with a lot of the genetic testing that we see today. So, that's also kind of bunk. Genetic testing for things like cancer, for things like heritable diseases, they normally come with things like a doctor's recommendation. Like if a doctor thinks you might have cancer and then orders a genetic test for you and it comes back that you have this gene associated with cancer, that's a good sign that it might be true. But if you're just getting a genetic test and you don't have any signs of cancer, who knows if you're going to develop cancer? Who knows if you already have cancer being present in your body? What's really the thing that we can rely on in these genetic tests is figuring out who's related to you, who's living right now, who's also done this genetic test. Because like I said before, longer fragments of DNA that are the same will correspond to, people who are closer related to you. So, in summary, you can find out your living relations really, really accurately, but you can't really find that much else out of genetic testing from direct-to-consumer companies with any sort of, certainty. So, why is this data valuable? Well, it's valuable for research. So 23andMe has partnered with large, big pharma companies like Genentech and Pfizer. They also have targeted ads, which rely on things that they garner from you from other things that aren't your genetic data, other data points. They give you a bunch of surveys. What's your medical history? What's your family's medical history? Do you have any allergies? These are non-genetic data that's pretty personally identifying. And they ask you this constantly. In fact, some of these companies are partnered with large, big pharma companies because they are, the largest database of, corresponding genetic and ancestral data and medical data. And lastly, you can upload your information from any of these sites to third parties. These third parties will connect you with people who are your distant relatives, or connect you with people who have the same sort of genetic profile as you. And that's always kind of dangerous, because when you upload your data to these sites, what are they doing with with it. So, what are they doing exactly with your genetic data? Where does it go? So, most of these sites will tell you that they don't sell your genetic data, they value your privacy. You're a valued customer. They're not doing this for your money. They're doing this out of the kindness of their hearts so you can learn more about yourself. And you know, they don't do anything with your data except like aggregate data. Aggregate data is sort of like, you know, it's 20% of people have these mutations. You know, it's not personally identifiable. But in reality, if 20% of people have mutation A and 5% of people have mutation B, and you have mutation A and mutation B, what are the odds of you having that? You know, that, you know, makes your genetic data much more identifiable if other people know that there's only like a 0.01% chance of you actually having that phenotype or genotype. And secondly, all these companies tell you that, you know, don't worry about it. If you tell us that you want us to destroy your spit and your data, we will. We'll delete it. It's fine. Yeah, that's not really true by law because there's a bunch of laws that state that for, you know, laboratory operations, you have to store data for a certain period of time. And, you know, they say they will delete your data, but they legally can't for several years. It's still going to be there. People can still use it. And their genetic testing companies bury things in fine print. So the first, you know, quote I have is, I think, from 23andMe. It says, "Unless we notify you otherwise, we will store your sample from a minimum of 1 year and a maximum of 10 years." That's a long time that they're storing your sample and they have your genetic information on file. They say that they will delete your file, but they might delete it after 10 years. Which is, you know, not useful to you. And the second quote is from the Ancestry Privacy Policies, or I think it's the Terms and Conditions actually. It says, "By submitting a user-provided content through any of the services you grant Ancestry a sub-licensable, worldwide, royalty-free license to host, store, copy, publish, distribute, provide access to, create derivative works of, and otherwise use such user-provided content to the extent in and in the form or context we deem appropriate, on or through any media or medium, and with any technology or devices now known or hereafter developed or discovered." So it's like, that's pretty comprehensive. You know, it's obviously worded as such. And it says that, you know, we will index your DNA while we have it, and then we own those indexes. So, you know, that's cool. That's fine. So, where does it go? You knew it was coming here. The government, the feds. Where do we see this? So, a company called Family Tree DNA helped to actually find the notorious Golden State Killer. And they did this by taking DNA that was at crime scenes, sequencing it to find all those SNPs, and sort of looking at genetic databases to see profiles who would have the same amount of DNA that would, you know, tell you that this person is pretty closely related, maybe a third cousin to this person. And then what they did was they took that person who was related to the Golden State Killer, and they found the common ancestor. So say they looked like they were a third cousin. They found the great-grandparents of this person. And then they looked at public records to find all of the descendants that would match the profile, so all of this person's third cousins. And then they, they sort of had demographic data. This person is a male. This person was probably from ages 20 to 40. And they sort of cut that down. And then they investigated all the remainders, and they found the person that they think is the Golden State Killer. And that person is still undergoing trials. And they're talking about the death penalty for this person. So when you think about this, that sounds kind of good. Don't we want killers to be found? Don't we want crimes to be punishable? But the ways that this was garnered sort of is a little bit concerning. So this is an excerpt from an article that interviewed an actual person who worked at this genetic testing company. It says, "We found the FBI in their database and heard them with our own ears saying, 'Look, we're not going away. You can hide and you can pretend we're not around, but we're going to keep coming in. If you make it impossible for us to put our samples in the database, okay, we'll just subpoena you and we'll force you to do it.'" So they actually noticed that the FBI was putting in samples that didn't match any of the other genetic testing sort of profiles. The data didn't look like anyone else's profiles. And when they questioned them about it, the FBI was just sort of like, "Yeah, we're the FBI, what are you going to do?" And, now this company is saying it's our moral responsibility to give the FBI access to our DNA to solve crimes. And this is reflected in their privacy policy, of course, but how many users read the privacy policy in its entirety? I don't. And furthermore, DNA fingerprinting, SNP, looking at SNPs, it's not infallible. It's not infallible at all. It's not even infallible when you go into forensic sites. If you have a person who packaged this DNA and shipped it, and they shed skin cells in it, their DNA is in it now. And if you sequence their DNA along with the other person's DNA, and that mixture of DNA looks like your criminal's DNA, you might end up convicting somebody who's innocent, even though their actual profile would tell you that they are innocent. And this has actually happened before. In 2003, I think, where a lab technician sort of got foreign contaminant in a perpetrator's DNA sample and then convicted them. And they got exonerated later, but they spent some time in prison. And if you spend some time in prison as a innocent person, that's always a loss. That's always a bad thing. And so it's not infallible. There are millions of SNP sites, but companies that have this data only sequence, tens of thousands. There's a whole 2 orders of magnitude there that they're not sequencing. And DNA from crime scenes don't always come in sort of pure samples. It's not always just the perpetrator's DNA. Maybe they punched someone in the face and there was blood on their hands. Now that victim's DNA is also in the sample. And when they did a study about whether or not forensic labs across the United States would identify a victim as a perpetrator from a mixed DNA sample, something like 73 out of 100 said that the victim was the perpetrator. 73 out of 100 would say that an innocent person is a criminal. And jurors believe that because why would you not? DNA is a science. It's not objective. And there's also a bunch of biases and moral ambiguity present with using this to sort of solve crimes. So the databases we have currently are more complete and more accurate for people of Caucasian descent. People of, for example, West African or Asian descent, the databases are not complete at all. We don't actually know what most people look like from those demographics. And so it's a lot easier to say that a person of less sort of, people that we have in our database less, have more sort of uncertainty. And these people also, especially African American people, happen to be people who are more targeted by the United States police and the government in the United States. And also, there are examples of, fetal tissue in sewers and such being sort of sequenced and referenced back to the mothers, but they're actually miscarriages. They're actually accidents. But there have been records of people being charged with attempted infanticides in states where abortion is more of a controversial topic, so to speak. So you open the door to fetal tissue sort of sampling, fetal tissue S&P profiling. You can incriminate women of crimes in your company of quote-unquote attempted infanticide, or let's call it what it really means, abortion, from DNA of miscarried fetuses. So even if they didn't want an abortion and a miscarriage happened, and they're trying to get rid of this and wipe it from their minds, they can still be sort of charged with this, and that's honestly a shame. So let's get to our final point. What does it mean if a genomic database is breached? So the first thing we look at is sort of genetic phishing. So you know that, Dave over here, the product of millions of years of evolution and natural selection, is looking for his long-lost biological dad. He's adopted, he wants to know what his roots are. If you know that he's on this database looking for people that he's related to, and you know his genome, you know his name, what you can do is you can say, hey, I've located your father, and all I need is your credit card information and your social security number. And that's very tempting for poor Dave over here, who is, your average Dave, and doesn't know anything about phishing or OPSEC. And it's predatory, the way all phishing is. But it's almost worse because it's coming from this standpoint of finding what you've lost. Instead of, please reset your password and give us your old password and also your credit card information because... And what a new paper has found is that you can actually identify people using their genetic information that you get from the S&P sequencing from a direct-to-consumer company. So you can actually identify a person's name from their DNA based on, publicly available data. And so what this experiment did was they found a random subject, and they got them from the 1000 Genome Project. And you start with the raw genetic information. You don't know anything about this person. You upload it to a database, and you using this publicly accessible database, this third-party database, you find DNA with similar stretches, around 30 to 600 centimorgans, fourth to second cousins. And using public records of birth, you'd like say, okay, I know this person is female, I know this person is from the ages of 40 to 20. And so you triangulate that data based on what you already know of this person. And then you can find their name, and from their name, if you have all of the other personal identifying information from these sites, gathered from these sites on purpose from survey data, you can find exactly who they are, where they live, what their medical history is, and, basically everything else. That's great. But okay, but what if none of my third cousins have done this? I'm pretty safe, right? Okay, let's do a theoretical case scenario. Let's say you're an early generation millennial, born about 1980. The birth rate at 1980 is about 2. Let's say the generational gap is about 25 years, and you're some milquetoast white European ancestry, European descent. You're a U.S. national, so you live here. Third cousins are descendants of not your grandparents, not your great-grandparents, but your great-great-grandparents. So that's 4 generations ago. It's hidden. Oh, okay. So let's say your great-great-grandparents, if you're born in the 1980s, were born in the late 1800s, with a birth rate of 7 to 9 kids per family. We don't actually have data on this because birth censuses weren't around back then, but this is a general approximation from historians. Then your great-grandparents are born in the early 1900s with 3 to 4 kids per family. Your grandparents are born in the 1930s with 3 kids per family. Your parents' generation are born in around the 50s and the 60s, 2 to 3 kids per family. So let's do some math. So you have the number of your kids your great-grandparents had, multiplied by the number of your kids your great-uncles and your great-aunts had, so your great-grandparents' kids that aren't direct descendants of you, multiplied by the number of kids your first cousins twice removed, or your grandparents' generation that aren't related to you, had, and the number of kids your parents' generation, or your second cousins once removed, had. So that's 6 times 3 times 3 times 2, by the low estimate, for each parent. And then you had to multiply by 2 because you have parents. And so you end up having 216 third cousins. Are you sure that all of your 216 third cousins haven't uploaded anything to any of these direct-to-consumer ancestry sites? If you're a Caucasian person living in the United States, that's a pretty slim chance. But, we're also not talking about the closer than third cousins, your second cousins, your first cousins kids, if you were born in the 1980s, who are now adults. Your siblings' kids. I didn't count the grandparents because if you're born in the 1980s, they might not have survived until now. But that gives us about 304 people alive right now that have genetic information that are the same or more than your third cousins, not including your potential children or you yourself. It's so, a genetic researcher presented at the Pacific Symposium of Biocomputing this year, based on this paper published in 2018, saying that if you're a Caucasian and you leave DNA on a glass a year, there's a 60% chance you can get some identifying data. If you can get an SNP profile from that saliva you left on the glass. So that's 60%. In the paper published in 2018, the paper also stated that it would increase 99% of finding, identifying information, your name specifically, from your S&P profiles alone. If you're Caucasian and living in the US, if the total population sequenced from the United States is more than 2%. But this paper was written when the nearest statistic to the present of people who got sequenced by these companies was 12 million. Recent reports have put that number of people who gave their genetic information to these ancestry sites at 26 million people worldwide that had been tested and whose genome, sequences are on file. Do you really think that none of your relatives are on these databases? And if so, how? And this is assuming the lowest number of average from each of these generations. I had a professor from high school who told me that he had 16 brothers and sisters because his family was Irish Catholic. Imagine if that was spanning back several generations. That would be an insane amount of third cousins. And then, what happens when a genome database is breached? It has massive implications for a lot of things. For example, your personal survey data, the stuff you give them that's not genetic, your medical history, your family's medical history, your allergies, etc. Genetic discrimination, it opens the door for people to say, this person has X amount of SNPs correlated with autism. And so, because we know this, we're just not going to hire them, because we don't want to hire autistic people. Genetic discrimination is something that's protected. But if you got this information through illegal means, if the data was breached, they don't necessarily have to tell you why they're, not giving you the job. They don't have to let you know. And it also opens the doors for things like identifying individuals and their relatives, because genetic data is not just you. It is your family and your, cousins and your children and your children's children. So people who are under witness protection, people who are intelligence agents, their identities could be exposed, their privacy could be breached because of if a database like this got breached. Because you cannot change your genetic information. What are you going to do if someone has your genome? You can't change it. It's yours. It's a fingerprint. And so, I want you to think about this when you get a 23andMe present for Christmas this year. And I want you to weigh the risks, and I want you to weigh the benefits. And I want you to ask yourself, do I trust the FBI, first of all, and these companies to always and forever hold my and my descendants' best interests at heart before you take that test? And thank you. That's my talk.